Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So we're towards the end of bio here, and I know many people have been here since Monday, and so I really appreciate your coming and joining us for our final session for the digital health track at bio. My name is Beth Rogozinski. I'm with a digital health company called Therapies, and it's been my great honor this year to work on the digital health committee here at bio. In addition to what we're going to see today, we've had a number of amazing experts and really thought leaders that are pushing and driving the whole of digital health forward. And I know that in many of our sessions, we've had experts as well in the room. So I want to thank you all for being here with us today. It's my great pleasure today, and we've got a bit of a longer session here because we think that this topic is so very exciting for so many people. How many people here have tried VR? Oh, this is an advanced audience. All right, good. And so what we've got for you today is we're looking at AI-driven empathetic therapies, and leading the charge and taking over is Sanjeev Wadhwa. Sanjeev actually has a new company that he's founder and CEO of called Singularity. Sanjeev has a background at Ernst & Young where he was a partner running the life sciences division, digital health. He's got decades of experience in this area, and he's put together a panel of experts that are going to discuss with you all today where we're at currently with AI and virtual reality therapeutics and where we think that this is all going to go. So please join me in welcoming Sanjeev.
Thank you, Beth. We got too many technology pieces all connected here, so forgive us if you're awkward stance while we're trying to speak here. I decided after about 30 years in the life sciences, healthcare, biotech industry that we had spent a lot of time on drug technologies and biotech and not enough on factors that impact health in other ways. So we as a startup are focused on the context of health and then marrying that up with medical and drug technologies, and I'll get into that a little bit later. We believe that AI as a fundamental technology has to come to pharma, biotech, and healthcare industry. You'll see some examples from our panel, real life examples of where this is being applied. So when I picked this panel, I just didn't want it to be a strategy discussion. I wanted this to be an applied AI VR discussion. So anything you see here is actually been applied or being applied in clinical science, in research, and the technology is being developed. So without further ado, let me introduce my panelists who will kind of go into their background, and you see some of their brief introductions here. To my right, immediate right, is Walter Greenleaf. Walter is a neuroscientist, Chief Scientific Officer for Therapeutics, and also is part of the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. To his right is Chris Chen in the middle. Chris Chen is the Senior Director at HTC Vive, which is a VR technology company, for those of you who don't know. And you'll see amazing examples of how we can move beyond screens like this to room scale VR, and how technology companies are looking at healthcare. So an amazing perspective will be brought to bear from Chris's background. And then to his right is Dr. Skip Rizzo. Skip heads up the Medical Virtual Reality Lab at University of Southern California Institute of Creative Technologies, and has done tremendous amount of work in mental health. So diverse backgrounds, different experiences, all patient-related. This is all about patient centricity. And without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Walter Greenleaf.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here for a few personal reasons that I'll go into when we go through my talk. For the sake of having time for questions and to do a demo, I'm going to give my talk, which usually takes about 45 minutes to an hour. I'm going to press it down to 30 minutes by skipping every third word. It's an intelligent group here, so I'm sure you'll be able to fill in the gaps. What I'm going to do is give you an overview of some of the amazing things that are going on with VR, AI, and augmented reality technology. They're all converging to make a big difference, and they're coming out really fast. And so I'll give you some examples and an overview of what's going on. And then we can go into detail with some of my colleagues and some demos. When I worry about things, which I do sometimes, these are the top four in my mind that I think we all should have our eyes on. In particular, for me, the healthcare crisis and an aging population. I spent some time running a program at Stanford at the Center on Longevity, looking at changes in cognition with age. And I'm very concerned with an aging population, both here and worldwide, and the economic impact of that, as well as the social impact. As you probably know, the US population has doubled since the 70s. And the proportion of people who are living to be in their 70s and 80s has really increased tremendously, with a lower proportion of caregivers to take care of them. In my opinion, the only way out of this bind is through technology. We have to leverage technology. With the demographics, we just do the math. We add time to people's existing age, and we won't have enough caregivers to take care of an aging population. We have to use technology to do that. Fortunately, there's a digital health revolution going on. Everybody in this room is already aware of that. Many changes involving sensors, leveraging the internet, focusing on the patient as opposed to the point of care being the clinic. Right now, almost every medical device has been moved from an analog format to a digital format. And this allows us to, and also we can collect data from people at large out in the wild as they behave and go through their lives. The quantified self-movement have been the early pioneers here. Combining this with some tremendously powerful back-end systems with deep analytics where we can push interventions to patients, suck information out from devices, put it together and do some predictive analytics, allowing us to do personalized medicine. It's really amazing what the data analytics will allow us to do, and we're just getting started. So we see a future where AI and analytics will help us personalize medicine. But the question is, how do we change behavior based on that? And that's one of the things that I'll talk about and my colleagues will talk about. So again, as part of this digital health revolution, we have a revolution going on in medical applications of virtual reality technology, and concomitant with that is the revolution in AI technology and other enabling technologies such as virtual humans. It's my perspective, and I'm constantly harping on Chris about this, that the technology providers in consumer electronics need to be aware that gaming is not going to be enough. People will not be able to sustain, and the electronics companies will not be able to be successful if they don't migrate what they're doing with VR and AR and AI technology out into the enterprise. And one of the deepest verticals is going to be medicine. I think it's going to be the most significant vertical, actually, in the future. So here's the bottom line for my talk. Current concepts and technologies that we use in VR and AI have almost a 30-year history. Most people aren't aware of this. Many of the startups that are coming up right now don't realize that we've had VR technology for decades. And we've had research groups such as SCIPS studying what works, what doesn't work, what are the blind alleys, where are we successful. And we have heuristics, algorithms, clinical pathways that we know are effective. And finally, we have the technology to apply that. Recent changes make this technology accessible and affordable. And also, I think very importantly, the concept that we can use a virtual environment to change behavior, to act as a point of care, to reach the patient. That concept is a little bit more acceptable than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So VR and AR technology will affect all arms of healthcare, prevention and wellness, improved assessments, and this is very important, better interventions, pushing out to remote areas and having the point of care be where the patient is, and better management of chronic conditions. And I'll give some specific examples about this. Here's why I'm particularly excited to be here. I started working in the field of VR back in 1984 when I had more hair, and we all had more hair back then. And it's been an amazing thing for me to see the technology just burst out in the last few years. And it's very exciting to, Skip and I have been working together as colleagues for most of that span. So it's particularly wonderful for me to be here with my friend Skip, sharing the stage and talking to you. Back when we first started, the head-mounted displays were so heavy we sometimes had to counterbalance them with a brick, and we used Silicon Graphics Onyx machines that cost $500,000 and were the size of a small refrigerator, but it worked, and we were able to do some basic research and improve upon it, and we're here today with a background of protocols and understanding of what are the right pathways to go down. But we've had so many false starts. Back in 2008, I was invited to go over to help with the post-traumatic stress after the Sichuan earthquake in China. I optimistically thought we could use VR to help with the 50,000 people who were suffering from stress disorders as a result of that earthquake. The technology worked, but it was too expensive. We could not scale. We could not reach enough people using it. But now we can. With today's technology, we could respond to a major disaster and help intervene with a large population, just using existing cell phone technology. So as you know, now is the time for VR. Every major technology company has a plan and an intervention here. And I also suspect that most of the major medical device and pharmaceutical companies are looking very closely at this. But Samsung, Facebook, through Oculus, Microsoft, Google, HTC, Sony, the list goes on. All the major consumer electronic companies have made big bets on this technology, so it's not going to go away. And by the way, when I talk about VR technology, I have a very expansive definition. I also include AR and mixed reality technology. To me, it's just a spectrum of immersion. So I use VR as sort of my shorthand for immersive technologies. Sometimes we don't have to wear a head-mounted display. There's some wonderful room environments that we can step into and interact with the virtual environment. There's a tremendous number of startups that are developing some really great enabling software and sensor technology in the VR arena. There's literally thousands of them out there right now. And investments in the medical arena is happening too. MindMaze raised $100 million at a $1 billion valuation to do neuro VR, stroke rehabilitation as a starting point. Paratherapeutics is working with Skip's group on post-traumatic stress disorder. They've raised a significant amount of Series B funds. Limbix is funded by Sequoia, and they're doing some excellent work also for post-traumatic stress. And Reflection Health. So these are just a few examples of the venture-backed companies that will be successful in this arena. I've contacted and interacted with at least 72 emerging medical VR companies, and those are just the ones that I've been able to reach and get to know a bit in 18 different sectors of medicine. So it's really happening across the board. It's not just a few areas of medicine, but a very large smorgasbord of wonderful interventions being pioneered in these domains. Meanwhile, the predictions are, and these are probably very conservative projections, it's predicted that within 3 years, 30 million people will have VR systems and can use them. And that's an opportunity for us to both collect data and push interventions out to that population. A lot of this is going on in China. I recently got back from there, and the government has put a $10 billion plus poker chip on the table, investing in the technology. And there's also a large number of investment funds active in Asia focusing on this technology. We're also, of course, very active here in the US and in Europe, but China, I think, will be a very early adopter of this technology. But again, one of the key points I'd like you to take away is we're not just new out of the clamshell with this technology. We've been doing the fundamental work for more than 30 years, and there's a large collection of publications on PubMed that you can find where VR has been shown to be effective and useful. Most of these are pilot studies because it was too expensive to stand up a $500,000 machine to do the research with a large population. But now that the technology is affordable, we can refine what we learned from those smaller studies and push them out to larger validation studies. So now I think it's time that we'll be able to move forward with a big surge. Very quickly, I'm going to go over the overall medical applications of VR, AR technology. And again, one of the underpinnings of this technology is what we do with big data analytics and AI technology. Health and wellness. Preventive medicine is a big arena. Training of medical procedures, not just surgery, but everything we do at a clinic. Better assessments, more objective assessments. And then better interventions. So I won't have time to go into great detail, but I'll give you a feeling for it. In medical training, we train clinicians how to work with a patient, how to work with each other. We teach them how to use equipment and tools. We have team training that can be done in a virtual environment. I've seen a wonderful environment that was used by the city of Portland to coordinate an emergency response from the fire department, police department, emergency room clinicians, the mayor's office, how to handle an emergency. Then one of the things that we'll talk about in today's session is how VR can be used to help people understand empathy. Of course, we've had VR in medicine for many, many years. There's simulation centers. We haven't called it VR, but we've had, for example, arthroscopic simulators that people could go to a center and learn very precisely how to, in practice, how to use a new surgical tool and learn to do an operation. But those were location-based and expensive, and it's changing now. We have systems that can be done at the clinic. Here's an example of a system using the Vive, a clinician preparing and practicing how to place a tibial nail using a new medical device. So a way to get familiar before the operation and rehearse maybe the sequencing of procedures. There should be sound for this, if possible. Well, it's not that important, it's just some piano music. But you get the sense here that this is something now is taking what was done at very expensive, multi-million-dollar facilities that people would have to fly in and spend the weekend. Now they could do it at the clinic. And there's a number of companies pursuing this. Here's the work of our friend Parvati Dev. She's been doing this for many years, and she has systems that can do training of a clinical process. Just a quick example of, I think this is preparing a patient for dialysis. And this could be multi-user, where a team can practice how to prepare a patient. And we also have some wonderful virtual patients that have an overlay of physiological data, so you can see how what you're doing is affecting their heart rate, their respiration, how the anesthetics are affecting them. We also have some great data fusion systems where people can fuse data from MRI and ultrasound and plan an operation in advance. Again, I'm moving along very quickly. I wish I had more time to go into greater detail. I think the biggest impact of virtual reality in medicine, one of the biggest impacts is going to be on better assessments, especially for cognitive assessments. We can, of course, capture, using some of the emerging technology, movement and have a better way of assessing stroke rehabilitation, for example. But I think being able to capture behavior in a standardized search environment is going to be breakthrough technology. So we're developing new approaches for cognitive assessment. I'm not going to read this very long list. I'll just sort of mention a few highlights. There's, again, several groups doing some amazing work on stroke and traumatic brain injury recovery, using VR for both the acute and the post-discharge phase. We have great systems for ocular rehabilitation for strabismus and amblyopia, amazing systems to help with both acute and chronic pain, and systems to help people learn to manage their weight. Moving into more of the behavioral medicine arena, we've got systems for addictions, for schizophrenia and psychosis, for generalized anxiety disorder, depression, non-cognitive impairment, the list goes on. phobias and anxiety disorders, conduct disorders, anger management, learning disabilities. It's a very, very long list. So we can do interventions and make a big difference in the field of behavioral medicine, which is an area which is really primed for disruption. We also have a number of systems that are very important for promoting health and wellness, to help the patient, motivate the patient to adhere to a lifestyle or a protocol that's going to improve their lifespan. And here's another important point. VR is a portable system, can be a portable system. So it doesn't have the high-end systems like the Vive right now are in clinics, but it's all migrating out to portable systems. So we can reach people in remote areas who otherwise might be very hard to reach. And you'll talk later, Skip, I think, about virtual humans and how they're going to be an important part of this, both as simulating patients, but also simulating a clinical encounter and team training. So just very quickly, we use VR for exposure therapy for post-traumatic stress, phobias, and anxiety disorders. In this case, Skip will give an example of how BraveMind has been used to look at combat PTSD. We also use VR for, here's an example of using a system for evaluating ADHD. I think I'll skip through the video of that. But it's based on actually some of Skip's research on using a virtual classroom as an ecologically correct way of studying a student and how they are able to focus and what are the traits affecting their ability to pay attention to a lesson. At the beginning when I talked about, I mentioned how I'm very worried about aging and the aging crisis. I think virtual environments are going to make a big difference for senior care all along the stack of care, helping with acute and chronic pain, depression and anxiety disorders, addressing isolation and loneliness, disability solutions, and then training staff of how to have empathy for someone who might be in a very much different age group. We've had great success using VR to teach situational confidence and refusal skills for people with addictions. And we've also used VR to help with stress inoculation. One example of this is a project that we're in the middle of doing with my group at Stanford called, and we've sort of borrowed this, inspired by Skip, it's called Project Braveheart. And we're working with kids who are scheduled for a cardiac surgery. And in their case, we know weeks in advance what the worst day of their life is going to be. So we do something about it. We send them home with a VR system that allows them to meet other kids who've gone through the procedure, understand the layout of the hospital, maybe learn some relaxation and diaphragmatic breathing skills. We sort of gamify it so they actually do it. But it's a way to prepare them and reduce their anticipatory anxiety for a very scary day, and also help them learn to navigate the hospital layout. So here's a very quick video about Project Braveheart.
Braveheart is an interactive VR experience developed to reduce stress levels in children who will be undergoing a surgical procedure. Patients and their families are guided through a 360-degree video tour of the hospital by a virtual companion. The gender-specific tour guide provides a friendly, approachable, and relaxing tour of the facility and introductions to doctors and key hospital staff. Along the hospital tour, patients visit the key rooms they'll encounter on the day of their procedure to help make the unknown more familiar. Children learn about parts of the procedure and can even practice mindfulness and relaxation exercises. The intuitive software design allows the user to navigate through scenes and applications, learning the hospital layout, all within Braveheart at their own pace, creating a first-of-its-kind, interactive and immersive video environment.
I use this as an example of
when Braveheart is finished,
a way we could develop an interactive product that makes a difference without a lot of great expense. In this case, we use 360 video, which is a lot easier to capture and stand up on a VR system than using a computer-generated environment, and it's already making a big difference with the patients. VR has been used for pain distraction, studied very effectively over the last 20 years, making a significant difference in reducing the use of narcotics in burn clinics, for example. And we've gone so far as trying to understand what parts of the brain are affected by this intervention. We know that the pain reduction is not just transitory. We know that immersive systems are more effective than non-immersive systems. And we know that active distractions are more powerful than passive distractions. So again, there is a history of research in this area. It's not just new and get going. We've also used VR for training clinicians how to handle difficult situations. I think I'll just show a few seconds of this video clip. In this case, we green screened a person in rather than using a computer avatar, so we can get the micro expressions of the face. But this is an opportunity for a clinician practicing how to deliver bad news, something you want to get right.
Breast cancer. I don't know how I can handle this. It's just,
So much like a flight simulator, we can practice extreme situations, get familiar, and get ready to do it for the 1 in a million things that you need to be ready for. We can also help physicians see things from the patient's point of view. So very quickly, I'm going to go over the neuroscience of why VR is such an effective intervention. We know that VR is very engaging cognitively. It can activate the brain's reward systems. We can gamify things. And I don't know, if you guys have tried VR, they've probably made you walk a plank as a demo where you're up on a high building and it shows how engaging it is because many people won't walk that plank and the ones that do hesitate to jump off the plank. The principle here is in order to change a brain system, we have to activate a brain system. And VR is particularly good at evoking a cognitive state. And once we evoke a cognitive state, we can teach people the skills to change their cognitive state. We also can shorten the feedback loop. We can have people see the effects of choosing certain groceries in a grocery store. It immediately affects their avatar. And we can leverage the mirror neuron systems in sort of a sneaky brain hack, which we call your future self. Now, most of the research here has been done on undergraduates, and believe me, they don't like seeing their future self. Anything more than 5 years in the future is particularly disturbing to them. But we can use this as a way of seeing how the choices they make. And we did a study where we gave them some money, some actual money. And we gave them the choice of investing in retirement or spending on whatever you want. And the students who'd had a chance to bond with their future self, and we have some tricks to help them do that, saved money for retirement, an astonishing thing. We're currently using this to help caregivers have some empathy for elderly people. So again, there is a rationale behind why VR is so particularly engaging to help in behavioral medicine. We activate many aspects of the brain's reward systems, and the attention that we can get with VR by blocking out the rest of the world, the novelty and excitement that can be generated, and the fact that we can activate reward systems allows us to harness the brain's ability to change and to learn. So again, to summarize, I think VR is going to make a very big difference in medicine as we move forward. And again, when I say VR, I include AR and AI technology as an enabling part of that. I think the work of my colleagues here of coming up with virtual humans to allow us to do that is going to be particularly exciting, and I think it's a very exciting time. If you're interested, we're having a conference at Stanford. I think Chris and Skip, you're both going to be there in October, focusing on VR and behavior change. Okay, that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Walter. Just as a point of process, we'll have the panel discussion towards the end as you get to see some of the real demos. You sort of see the stage set up here a little bit in terms of the tripod stands here, and Chris and Skip will actually be demoing the gear and how it works in realistic settings with patients, so you'll get to experience the technology yourselves. So in terms of just, starting this process and where AI becomes a foundational platform for creating patient experience. So if you think of VR as the experience part, underlying that, there has to be a capability to deliver and formulate that experience. And we as a startup started to think about how do you go about doing something like this. And I use this example of a real patient here. This particular patient was a schizophrenic for 25 years and overcame it through use of some of these technologies in VR. But underlying his journey, as he went through the journey, I experienced through his friendship some of these comments, which I've outlined, as to what he was going through, in terms of a mental anguish as he worked through this journey for him. He gave me some of this feedback as, I need technology to be empathetic. And if it doesn't understand me, if it's just telling me when to take my medication, it's not enough. It needs to sense my emotional state and tell me when I should be taking that medication. It should sense my psychosis onset and be able to tell me if my behaviors are wrong. So all the indications that Walter just walked you through, these 7-8 points tend to capture that as a patient state of mind. And one thing in particular always hits me when I talk about this story is when in one of the discussions, this patient actually wouldn't leave his room for many days, stayed in his room, never left the room, never called anybody. And there are a lot of emotional triggers around. They don't call anybody. They don't pick up the phone for days. If they pick up, they don't talk much. Whatever they do say is very clumsy. The sentences are very clumsy. There's not a pure communicative, verbiage to what they're talking about. But I could live with that as long as they're in sort of the safety of their home. This individual actually would walk out at 2 a.m., sit in their car, and just drive around the neighborhood with their eyes closed. Because the suicidal emotion, the onset was already there. So I tell you this story because, the words of empathy, cooperation with the technology, helping me with the societal connection. Societal connection seems to be the biggest thing these patients want. And how can we connect? Can I connect? Can somebody reach out to me? Can they be my mentor? Can they be my coach? Is there a platform where I can experience and just talk about what I'm going through without, a medication being prescribed to me? So I set this context of, where part of our jobs as innovators is to see where the world has been. And I've spent 32 years in this industry only to realize we can count the cures on our hands. And I would go as far as to say, if we have to disrupt what we do, our methods are not working. They're working in some ways, but they're really not working. So what can we do different? And so if I was to, ask a question, what if we could run 1 million N-of-1 trials, or experiments as I call them? I mean, they're not driven by drug. What if the software was the drug and the physician was a virtual avatar? What if I could get that virtual therapy in a different way rather than it has to be a drug every time? We're trying to launch a couple of trials in India. So Live Singularity is a platform. We have aggregated about 100 million patient records. And we started with data because everything has to be built on that foundation. Otherwise you can't achieve some of these discussions. But our driving factor was a third question. And based on this patient's emotional state, which was, could I actually predict and prevent rather than detect and treat? And our industry is based on detect and treat. It's too far down. It's too far down their patient journey, for me to intervene and say, well, take these antidepressants or take this and that, and you'll get better. Even with cognitive behavioral therapies, we have done good, but we haven't hit the ball out of the park. So we took a step back and we said, well, what can we do with AI? And then what could be different that we could bring to the equation? So if I was to think of the context of our industry, I would say that's the innermost circle that you see on this diagram. So I have the genome approach, I have the drug-based approach, I have a biomarker, a molecular marker approach. And that's where we have started because that's what we could measure. And we're still trying to measure genetic variants. And I've been through a number of sessions here at this conference. I come every year, and I continuously hear the same story that we have 2,000 variants of this new gene that we discovered many years ago. And I'm like, how do we conquer that next, right? Even just to get beyond that. And then there is Craig Venter's discussion on the whole other end, but I can do the whole genome sequence and the whole exome sequence for less than $500. So I waited for that technology to improve. So one of the trials we are trying to launch in India, and for economical reasons, is we are going to bring in multi-comorbidity conditions into the model. So enough about dealing with single disease pathways. All these patients are highly complex. If you imagine a series of, the Olympic rings model, right? And I give you that example because there's a lot of intersections between those circles. We're not measuring intersections. We're not measuring what happens to these patients. If I throw a pebble in a pool and the lake ripples out, we're not measuring those ripples. We're just measuring, where you threw the pebble in, and that's kind of, known, and we identify a biomarker. We don't measure other states. So we began with a context in mind and the outermost area. Could I measure your context all the time? So our premise is 60 to 70% of your health is driven by your phenotype. And could I take your lifestyle, your behaviors, and begin with your context rather than beginning with your disease? And if I can begin with your context and measure that context and be able to correlate some of these factors, then maybe I don't need that treatment pathway. Maybe the treatment is software. Maybe it's something else. And why to begin that journey? So the million N of one is not just a concept for us. It's actually something we're going to go ahead and deploy in 3 populations with diabetes, COPD, and progression to lung cancer. And we're going to do it with 2 different academic medical centers and with a commercial client to be able to understand what happens in real-world evidence studies rather than a trial-driven or drug trial-driven model. So in order to do that, in order to build our technology, we accumulated, you need data. And so we said, well, what kind of data do we need? And then how do we begin this journey? So we have, initially, as a startup, you have to focus on, what can you do with what you have resource-wise. So we have accumulated EHR, EMR data, 100 million patient records. And we have connected that to about 47,000 patients which came out of ICU stay. Highly complex, highly comorbid populations. And we have used their biosensoring data, so actual biometrics, and can we predict the next event within that clinical setting, whether they're in a hospital system, whether they're in a home, whether they're just walking along their neighborhood. How can I get that data back, which tells me about their clinical state? And then we aggregate that with your continuous exposures, which is where the environment and your context comes in. What are you breathing? How far do you live from the street? What's your demographic like, right? I don't know anything about you. I just know inclusion-exclusion criteria in a clinical trial. So as much real world as we can build into this is our goal. And finally, then, how do we incorporate behaviors and some of the things I talked about, this patient up front. We can, based on our technology, predict in 14 diseases today with anomaly prediction in 2. The anomaly prediction can be done up to an hour ahead, maybe even 5 minutes ahead. So if you can imagine if you're an ICU stay patient, so why do I say this? I say this because our physicians are in short supply. People like Walter and Skip are in short supply. Our nursing staff is in short supply. How do I detect whose event is more important? Who needs priority, right? And so in an ICU setting, for example, number of patients need care. Can we actually divert staff to one place or another? And so here's an example of a patient from our database, and to give you a sense of why I think the world is not uniquely just diabetes issues. Diabetes could be 1,000 diseases underneath, much like we have discovered with cancer. So this patient, if you see some of this area highlighted in blue at the top, this is a patient who was in a hospital for 101 days, has 18 comorbidities, was there for 4 stays, totaling 101 days, passed on eventually. If you see below, he was on 220 medications. So, tell me anything you've heard at this conference, from genetic variants to all the digital technologies that will help this patient today. We can't. We can't. There's just too many combinations. There are too many permutations, too many treatment pathways. How do you narrow that spectrum? So we took this guy and we took this patient and we said, can I simplify? Can I even attempt to resolve his care pattern? Not everybody is like that, but if I can get to a better result, better health outcomes for this kind of patient, then I can probably get to a 25-year-old who's well and is healthy, right? Because his patterns will be much more sparse. But I need pattern data in order to build the underlying AI to be able to predict what could happen to this patient. So I give you this example because his hepatic encephalopathy was not even detected till his visit 3, and he had cirrhosis of liver in visit 4, and then he died. But he, as you see, he was a diabetic patient. He progressed to COPD. So if I was just measuring diabetes and I was getting great HbA1c outcomes, could I have done different for this patient? And all of you will probably agree, maybe not. Right? And that's the fallacy, what I believe is what the drug industry is living with, that just single-threaded cures work. They don't. Here's another example. We took one of his disease conditions in CHF, and we took the top 50 drugs that were being administered over time, and we can narrow his neighborhood down to the ones that matter. So the top right is some of the drugs that he was prescribed very often. So if you're looking at treatment pathways, this is a real-world evidence of what was working for him and what was not working for him. If you sum this down, why we say 14 diseases, we're growing capabilities to 80 diseases. This is a confusion matrix. It's a probabilistic model of how much can we predict on a certain patient population. So I did this extract, and I'll show you this in a second, but this is about 22,000 patients worth of data I'm summarizing on this screen across those 14 diseases I talk about. There's the other category at the end, which is all the other 80 or 1,000 diseases that I can't, have not worked on yet. But what we are achieving is at the bottom of the screen, if you look down the accuracy piece, we are in the 90s. So we do have some clinical utility for this kind of an AI solution, where we can look at highly comorbid populations, we can look at single comorbid populations, but we begin to assemble the knowledge in a way that gives us a very defined insight on how to approach a disease, looking at disease patterns as a technology. This is the other example I gave you of the ICU stay population. And so the biggest problem you have applying AI to our industry, to healthcare, is our patterns are different. We're all different. And we could all be diabetics, but we're all different diabetics. So what we observe in data is that what worked for me may not necessarily work for you, and how many pharmas know that, right? Real world evidence is very different. So what do we do when things don't work? So for the problem for AI is, you have to be able to do transfer learning, what we call transfer learning. What worked for Geisinger's population, which has been in Danville, Pennsylvania for 150 years, and the population is just resident there, it's above 65, they never move, very well defined, no mixing, we can probably do better prediction, versus a city center where you're sitting there, population is always a mix. How do I transfer what I just learned from Geisinger to New York City? Right? Very different problem. So what we have to do from a technology standpoint is make sure that our learnings are transferable. It's called transfer learning, and hence the reasons for working with different populations. I'll show you this piece live. What we are actually doing in the top half is we have taken technology to a couple of parameters where we are now capturing real live data on this complex patient I talked to you about earlier, the one with 101 day stay. And what you're seeing is the first big gap in his data. You see this ascending line, which is where we have no data on him. But then the two parameters you're seeing top left is SpO2. It's actuals. Actuals are in black, red is predicted. And then you see a blue line, which is sort of indicating the aspect of what's normal for this kind of parameter or population. Second bar is a percentage measure of the same, and you're basically sort of seeing anomaly likelihood. This is calculated over millions of calculations as to where we believe is an anomaly for this parameter for this patient. So precision health. And below that, you see BPM, beats per minute, and you're starting to see the scale is auto scale. It adjusts itself as it sees the data coming in. But what you're starting to, this is predicting 1 hour out what will happen to this patient. So right now, the green bars in all of these, the two anomaly charts, the green bar is a static measure because the system is learning from these patterns. It's looking at these millions of data points and it's learning what this patient's patterns are all about. So this is one of our attempts to see how can we deliver real-time interventions, not something where you go away and you wait. Can we deliver real-time interventions when necessary? Eventually, this patient, what we know from data, he did pass away. But 2 days prior to his passage, we had signals from SpO2, where the SpO2 dropped a little bit. So if you were just watching the actuals, if you're just watching his spirometry or his actuals, you would say he's normal. But our anomaly likelihood scores, having learned all the patterns of this patient, was predicting a higher anomaly likelihood. So if we had this kind of technology available to general populace, to even healthy populace, you don't know when the next event is going to come. And what's the worst that could happen? I'm wrong. That's the worst that could happen. What's the best that could happen? I've saved a life, or I have predicted an event and I've pushed it off. So you go for an extra doctor's visit, right? I mean, that's the worst you're sort of looking at. I'll stop. I'll get out of this because I want to give Skip an opportunity. But just to kind of show you another dimension of this data, and you can see this. These are the same 22,000 patients that we have employed Google machine learning with. And all the blue dots in this display, this is, we took, so this, as I said, this was 1.3 million patients. I extracted the 22,000 for this discussion today. And what we have done is we have mapped them to their multiple comorbid conditions. I can now take, these patients have about several thousand columns that describe their health state. We have distilled them down to about 600 features that you could use the data to actually say, well, how do these 600 features affect these 22,000 patients? From those 600 features, I needed a way to visualize. You always hear AI is a black box. You can't, see what it's doing. FDA needs proof. How can you show me it's going to give me the same result every time? I can't tell you if it's going to be the same result every time because data is real time. Data is going to come in on a real time basis. It's not static. It's not something I ran 5 years ago. It's coming. And if your state of life changes, then it's going to update. So what you see here is essentially a three-dimensional. It takes those 600 dimensions and it crystallizes it down to 3. Each of these dots is actually a patient, a de-identified patient. So these are all the patient numbers. And we can then label now for all the 14 diseases where my distribution is on this population. So I can actually just now see where the patterns of disease are, right? And this could be anything. This could be data, drug data. This could be my procedures in a hospital. This could be, all the interventions we are doing in diabetes. Could be anything, right? Because our data contains all that stuff, right? So this is one way. Now, if and the reason for visualization is because we don't understand how to unpack the black box. So we are unpacking it. We're showing you what's inside. But then, now you can actually see all the different trends of different diseases in this population. And so let's assume we decide that, we want to examine a certain trend in this population, and I want to be able to go back and say, I'm very interested in looking at, let's say, this cluster. So I can actually zoom into this particular cluster of patients. And now I can just say, isolate this data. And now I can only visualize that particular, data model. Now, this is happening, as it's working through it. And let's say I want to identify what's with this particular patient. I click on this, and I say, well, show me what's going on, with this patient's state. And I should be able to zoom in here and tell you that this patient has about 14 different comorbidities. So here we go. And now you can see the red dots in context of the whole population here. Here's all my conditional probability distribution of this patient. This patient is about a 20th each or a 15th each in Alzheimer's, chronic heart failure, COPD, diabetes, and osteoporosis. So please tell me which intervention would you go ahead with here? Hard to say just the diabetic one would work, right? Because there's a distribution, there's a complex network of diseases here. So what we have also done is another model which then says, okay, if this was my cohort of patients, can I actually use, can I look at patterns in all your diseases and all the drugs and all the procedures you went through and be able to correlate this data in real time? So what you'll see next is it's basically going to take this model of this cohort, it's going to blow it up, it's going to calculate what's called a medical neighborhood, what the chart I showed you before with the 50 drugs in the shape of a semicircle. And it's going to now blow this up, and it's going to start calculating in real time how these each patients correlate. So if you were looking at patient similarity, or if you're looking for cohort similarity, or patient identification for your drug trials, or looking for drugs with similar mechanism of action, or looking to see where VR would work versus not. This is a highly depressive patient, and he needs some other therapy rather than antidepressants because antidepressants haven't worked for him. We can begin to experience, we can deploy this technology. Just a couple of examples of, trying to show you how AI is being approached. So to conclude, what I would, say is that in order to sort of look at a VR model for us as a startup, what we took an approach was we need the foundation, and we need then to be able to build on a foundation of data, but then also show the FDA there's all this contextual data that's giving me different signals than what the drug signal is telling me. And that's highly important for any of the players, payers, providers, pharma, if you can think of that. And then we have to show that that's transferable to different populations. These learnings need to be transferable. And then from that perspective, if you were just walking around your neighborhood and I say, Beth, I'm sensing a 3 standard deviation departure from your past heart rate, which I measured over the last month. I feel there is a heart event coming. I suggest to go see a physician. Now, if you were an 85-year-old and just got this and don't know where your contact information is, and I know and I see this event is coming, I have your geospatial information, I have your context, I know where you are. Let me redirect you to the nearest facility, or let me actually inform the hospital staff that they should be awaiting you, your arrival, right? And that's where we are taking AI, VR technology. We want to build this virtual assistant model in order to be able to deploy this. So hopefully this sets you up for what I'm going to, bring our presenter next, Chris Chin, who's now going to take you down a journey where a technology company approaching this from a perspective of sort of saying, how do I then take this data and instead of, what I just showed you on a screen like this, can I create room scale experiences where I can actually walk around an eye and I can walk around a brain, and can I actually experience which nerve has to be operated on today, tomorrow? And then also, the reason I told you this story about this patient is you have to look at this from an empathetic perspective of what, this is a real life data, this is what the technology is telling me. Just superimposing a drug model is not suffice. It does not work for all the patients. It's not to say the work we are all doing is unimportant. It's just I think we have other modalities that can be brought in to accentuate this technology. Thank you for your time, and I'll introduce Chris Chin from HTC Vive.
Thanks, Sanjeev.
What do you want me to press?
I'll let you know.
You'll tell him?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, let me, son, can you guys hear me? Okay, great. Let me just get set up, because I have a lot of technology options in front of me right here. So I'll do some slides as well as
Need help?
some demonstrations simultaneously. So it'll be a little bit of a multitasking experiment. Okay.
You good?
Yeah, let me just get over here. This is the,
You were connected. We never
I'm connected
disconnected.
already. Okay,
That's
good.
mine.
Perfect. Okay, so do we have the slides? Do you have the slides?
Yeah, he does, but did you want to drive from yours?
I can do it from here,
Yep.
but then I can't go back. and
You can
forth.
use mine. You can use the one I just gave you.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. Okay. Do you have an HDMI? I do. Yeah, I do. Right, perfect, thanks. Okay.
There you go. Very good.
See it. It's such a
Yeah.
perfect.
All right, Chris.
All right, good.
Okay.
Takes too much longer to get them set up. We can take a few questions while he's
Well, while we are getting set up here, if there's any questions from the audience for Dr. Walter Greenleaf, or thoughts, comments.
There's one.
Just one.
Okay.
There's a mic here. Could you please use that? Sorry, can't hear you.
So would I need to manually do it, or are you able to do it between back and forth?
Right behind you.
No, it has to be switched. Oh, here.
What are you outputting now? Because I'm not.
This is
On the
just
virtual reality, how similar is that to life experience? Could it actually replace it in different situations and be better?
I think your question was how similar is existing VR technology to life experiences?
Right. And could some virtual reality experience actually replace and be better than the life experience?
You know, I think we're in the 300 baud modem days of virtual reality. It's pretty amazing what we can do now, and I hope you have a moment to try out some of the systems, but it's going to be so much better very soon. In terms of how realistic things are, I think they're realistic enough that we can engage the brain and do a therapeutic intervention very easily. So, but try it. You'll see if you have time for our demos here.
Skip, do you have a perspective?
Yeah, you know, I don't think that virtual reality is going to replace the full rich experience of everyday life. Virtual reality is just something that simulates or mimics an environment in which we can do things that you can't do so well in the everyday world, like control stimuli or capture performance under tightly controlled conditions. So I think that you know, we should be looking at it as how can we take something we know is good in everyday life in terms of an assessment or a treatment approach and try to find a way to amplify or extend those things by using very controlled virtual reality simulations. I don't see the day where kids are going to want to rather go to a virtual park than to go to a real park with a seesaw and a slide or whatever they have in parks these days. I think, you know, we're a little ways from that, but we'll use it for a lot of productivity and life enhancement purposes. But I don't think it's going to reduce our desire to be in full breathing, touching, smelling reality.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay, Chris, go ahead.
Great.
please.
All right. So thanks for your patience here. I think we're back on track technically. So I wanted to first acknowledge. I think Walter had a few of the same discussion points I had, but I wanted to kind of go in more detail around showing some of the demonstrations around it. Obviously, Walter and Skip are essentially legends in healthcare VR, so I will always defer to them. But wanted to give you kind of a quick overview. I think Walter touched upon this, but we do know that there's a brief history of VR. I mean, VR has kind of come into the public forefront the past few years, but in reality, we've seen it in the 60s and 70s. So these are some kind of DoD images from way back. And really kind of this was the first generation, if you will. This is kind of a 3D movie, if you will, type experience. And then we kind of went to the second wave. NASA obviously has been doing a lot of investment and R&D and simulation work in virtual reality and augmented reality, and they continue to be an innovator today. So back in the 80s and 90s, we kind of really had started getting you know, the next wave, the second wave, technology started coming together. We had more advances in computer graphics technology. There are actually arcades that started popping up in the early 90s, and they even made a postage stamp out of that too. So it did come, it's gone, it came again, left, and now we're back kind of into, well, this is not really the current generation, but this is another example of, imagine wearing that in your everyday activities. So we are really now at the stage where we have different types of VR experiences. This is something, I know we had the question earlier about different types of VR. Have you tried VR? So how many have tried the VR that actually have the phone basically in your face? Okay, so quite a few. And how many have tried the VR and actually tethered to a PC? So just, okay, so we still have a few there too. So there's differences. With the phone-based VR, you actually have only 3 degrees of freedom, so you can basically just rotate your head, pitch and yaw. And it's a really kind of a 360 experience. You can basically look all around, and it's wonderful, but there isn't really much you can do more beyond that. The interactivity is somewhat limited because it's somewhat gaze-based. There are more advanced devices by Google Daydream and Samsung Gear where you now have a controller to kind of act as a navigator. And so that's kind of one level of VR. It's more ubiquitous. It's definitely out there in the market, and there's certainly a great place for it too. Now, what we also have is positional as 3 additional dimensions. So that's actually called 6 degrees of freedom, and that's what we get in kind of the more high-end premium headsets like the Vive and others. And you can actually translate as well as rotate. So now you actually have room to move. The world moves in this perspective that you're moving towards or away from, and you can actually look all around. So that actually simulates and gets you to a much deeper level of immersion and really a sense of true presence that you can't get in basic kind of mobile VR at this stage. So here is example of the Vive, and where you can basically be seated, you can move around, you can actually stand up, you can walk around. The setup right here in front of me is essentially what is state-of-the-art today. And here's kind of what the current generation premium VR looks like. So you can see here, this guy actually catches the controller even though he's essentially blind. His viewpoint is blocked by his headset, but because of the tracking technology today, you can actually see that virtual object and catch that virtual object just as like you would actually see a ball in real life and catch that real ball. So right now the technology has really progressed in this third age of VR, if you will, where you have extremely high degree of tracking precision, you have much more robust computer graphics, and you kind of have really the bandwidth to be able to funnel that through, and that's also enabled by the internet, of course. So this is kind of a mixed reality setup where you can see a third-person view of what this person sees in VR, as opposed to what we'll be showing later on, which is more first-person, which is kind of what I'm seeing. But this is a very powerful way of envisioning what it looks like in VR. And now, of course, Walter does talk to me about healthcare in VR, but games is really the early adopter for VR. I mean, we all kind of understand that hardcore gamers love the visceral experience of VR first, whether it be shooting objects or killing robots. It's really kind of one of those things where gamers have really identified with VR, and they've been the earliest adopters. But that doesn't mean that it's actually not made its way into the enterprise. In fact, actually, it's being very heavily adopted by the automobile industry, for one, among others. So here's an example where you are basically in a showroom situation, but you don't need to be in an auto dealership. You could be at home doing this, where you're checking out the features of a car. You're able to look under the hood virtually, and you can actually be seated there. You could actually have the sensation of understanding what each feature of the car is, and it's a very good way of showcasing the car kind of to a wider audience. Every auto manufacturer out there right now is using VR. They're using it in manufacturing, they're using it in design, collaboration, and a lot of them are using it for showrooming too. But they all understand the importance and power of VR, and that extends well into the enterprise, beyond automobiles, into healthcare for sure. Now, the magic of VR, or the power of VR, is the fact that you can also do things that you can't do in real life. So this is a very popular application called Tilt Brush, where you can actually paint in 3 dimensions. You cannot do this in real life. You can't actually paint using the entire room as your canvas. It would be boxed by walls or ceilings, but you can actually now have unbounded ability to create whatever you want. A lot of times when people try this experience in VR, they actually start getting it. They understand the potential and the sheer power of how VR and how basically a computer system and a different set of screens can impact your emotions. So I wanted to dive a little bit into some of the healthcare applications. I know Walter had covered some of this, but I wanted to maybe have one of the foremost known doctors in the country talk a little bit about VR. So let's roll this video here. This came from CES, which is back in January, and he describes how VR in healthcare is, how game-changing it really is. Oops, can you run that video? Can you turn the audio up, please?
Beautiful Las Vegas.
This is day 2 at the Win for CES 2017, and today we're highlighting the medical facet of the Vive VR ecosystem.
What you see behind me is the best virtual reality of the body that I've ever seen. And for all the gamers out there, I know people like shooting things up, but this is where the real action is. This is the most complicated place to do battle. And then if I'm perfectly healthy, it's sort of cool. But if you got a problem, it's even more valuable. Why guess? We can actually look at it. As a doc, I can tell you this is immensely powerful, both to help me educate the next generation of physicians, but for patients, this is visually arresting material. I don't have to explain what the black and white x-ray means. You can actually see what it means in your own body. But even more importantly, to really fix healthcare in America, you need virtual reality. You can actually create Google Maps of the body with virtual reality. Imagine taking a computer screen and forcing you to understand the code behind it. That's what we expect patients to do. Forget all that. Let's bring it alive for you like the rest of the technology world has done. For most of man's history, even physicians couldn't look inside the body. We only guessed. That's changed over the last few hundred years, but we still don't let real people look inside their bodies. This changes that. I'm really proud that ShareCare Reality Labs can work with Vive because it allows us now to have the best technology to show you coolest images about what's happening in your body.
We've got a program called Life, which stands for Life-Saving Instruction for Emergencies. And in Kenya, they've been doing research for about 10 years on how to manage emergency situations for children. They've developed a set of guidelines and some training material, and they've been training people in a face-to-face fashion. And then we started talking to HTC, started telling us about the VR applications with the Vive. The main thing that we've got from it is the difference from other types of applications that people associate with VR. Vive is the first VR experience that we've kind of tried this out with, and it seems to work really well. In particular, is using the handsets. So one thing that you can do on the Engage platform is to pick up bits of equipment and move them around. That's what makes it different from the other methods that we've been trialing. So without having handsets and being able to walk over and come back again and move to the right place, that would be quite difficult to convey that kind of experience in any other modality that we've tried.
We create photorealistic 3D animations, and then we take those 3D models into a virtual reality world. We're showing a virtual reality medical training based on the anatomy and the physiology of the eye. I've decided to create an application more suited to educate people with a more tangible approach of actually being able to touch and feel and be educated based on that kind of interaction.
Okay, so as you just saw, I wanted to actually demonstrate for you one of the illustrious demos that Dr. Oz had called the Google Maps of the Human Body. But it's actually an experience called UVR. It's a great application of the medical and patient education. And I'm going to put this on, so it'll be a real-time live demo. Are you guys able to see the screen here?
We are.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now, one of the things about the Vive is you have the controllers, which you saw in the earlier videos, and basically these can act as tools or hands. Now, we have a female here, we can always change it to a man if we'd like. And then we can actually start taking him and opening him up into his different systems. Let's see here. So, nervous system, skeletal, muscular, etc. And we can actually take his organs. And let's say we want to look at the heart. So once again, this is very good about being able to illustrate how the heart operates. You can see the various ways you can represent the heart, either through flow, nerves, electrical impulse, and you can do cross sections here too. Now, you can do things like put in an ECG, you can adjust the heartbeat, you can look all around. It's a very powerful way for people to understand. Now, if I have let's say I have heart disease here, and I want to actually showcase to my patient that my blockage is about there. And I want to explain to my patient, well, what are some of the ways we can actually solve for this? And we can treat this with a stent. So the stent should come. It's not really cooperating right now, but in theory, the stent should come out, and you'll see basically the whole animation go forward and open up the arterial area that has the plaque buildup. Okay.
Impressive.
Okay, we can go back to the slides again.
I love that stuff.
Here is again another application that does more about medical training for medical students. In this case, it's in the realm of the optometry and eye physiology. Can you play that video? So it's more pedagogical approach to learning. You have definitions, quizzes, and contextual interactions. Yeah, are you able to play the video, Greg? well, we can probably skip past that. But what you can see is that, I can describe for you, is basically it's more of a quiz-based approach where they will overlay not just the anatomy parts, but they'll actually describe what they are. They will actually take you through the lessons, and then you actually will have quizzes at the end, and they will actually show you the analytics behind the quiz around where you actually didn't do as well, what you need to focus on. So again, it's real-time feedback, and if you think about the applications where you have actually AI driving that behind it and learning different patterns of behavior for students who are studying or anyone who's training to learn about the anatomy of the eye or the physiology of the eye, or anything in this case, you can actually imagine how that gets optimized over time. And the pattern recognition that AI provides in conjunction with the VR experience will make it a more smarter training tool. Are you back to the PowerPoint, please? Okay, the other one. All right. So this is actually another use case for healthcare. This is actually taking the actual CT scan or MRI and using this for pre-op surgical planning. So, for decades we've actually been training radiologists and surgeons to look at 3D images of your organs or your parts of your body in 2D ways. So you have planar slices of images laid out against the light, and that is actually quite unintuitive if you think about it. Why would you look at slices of an image as opposed to the image itself in full 3D? So it's very counterintuitive. What we have here is now you're able to actually take the DICOM data, look at it in VR, and surgeons can use it for planning. They can use it for identifying things that they can't see otherwise, and it's actually happening right now. So this is a company called Surgical Theater that does this, and I think the other application that VR affords is around visualization, not just of the DICOM data, but of the data you're showing, Sanjeev, right? So the data around all the behaviors and the patterns. That was great to see it on 2D flat screen, but what if you could actually dive in VR? You could zoom in just as easily as you did with selecting with your mouse and keyboard. You can manipulate the data in ways that you couldn't otherwise do it, and that has obviously huge implications in pharma. So we also have other applications around. Can you play this video? This is actually a
6 months ago, Pierre Martineau's left arm was in such excruciating pain he couldn't lift a kitchen
pain management
skillet, let alone
treatment,
this desk.
which is actually alive and well right now. Pain management, pain therapy are very big in VR.
With painkillers, so he stuck it out until he found Dr. Kim Bullock at Stanford, who offered him an unconventional treatment.
So you see both hands are moving together.
Virtual reality with high-tech goggles often associated with video games, now being used for something much more serious.
What I'm finding most surprising and promising is the amount of pain relief people are having.
Dr. Bullock, a neuropsychiatrist, says she made the remarkable discovery by accident while studying virtual reality for conditions like severe anxiety. A welcome side benefit of that treatment, patients' chronic pain disappeared, and quickly.
They'll have the pain relief for at least a week, and then for some people, they may have many months of the pain relief.
Yeah, I see that.
So what are these patients doing in the virtual world? For Pierre, he's actually moving his pain-free arm. But when he looks through the goggles, he sees the injured arm doing the work. In this case, trying to pop balloons that are floating all around him. After just 5 sessions, he says his pain disappeared.
The cost to me was really minimum, just a little bit of time and no side effects.
Dr. Sean Mackey, one of the nation's top pain experts, says the treatment works by tricking the brain.
And that's where the excitement for VR comes in, is the opportunity to rewire our brains into a more normal state so that we're not experiencing as much pain.
Is this the future of pain management?
I think it's one of the critical features of pain management.
Oh, yes.
For patients like Pierre, the future is already here.
So Dr. Kim Bullock is a neuropsychiatrist at Stanford, one of Walter's colleagues, and she's been very much at the forefront for VR. I wanted to show you actually this experience, so if you can switch over to the screen here on the virtual reality side. You guys able to see this? Okay, great. So again, this is not just exposure therapy, not just distraction therapy, but you're seeing that the neuroelasticity that's allowed by VR can actually allow you to rewire the brain and treat pain that way. So here's just an example of a wellness application that does do that. I mean, you saw the video there that had it with one arm with the burn victim, but this actually also allows you to do just general wellness. So this is actually a very relaxing experience, and even though I'm not a Tai Chi practitioner, I feel like I am, and I just feel actually de-stressed. But you get the sense for the fact that it's very rewarding. You have gamification going on here, and it really does impact the way people feel. In fact, I probably should be doing this more often. Okay, so I just want to give you a sense of that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, oops, can you move back to the laptop again, the Mac? The other one? The other computer. Nope. The other presentation, all right. Okay, perfect. Oh, yeah. So, in terms of empathy and virtual reality, there's a film artist named Chris Milk who gave a TED Talk 2 years ago, and he famously called virtual reality the ultimate empathy machine because of its ability to connect people to places and experiences that you can't get otherwise. Other mediums such as film, video, TV, what have you, they are just portals where you can actually just maybe see what's going on and hear what's going on, but that's it. When you're actually in virtual reality, however, you're actually there. You actually viscerally feel, hear, you can actually see it, it's all around you, you can move in that space. And those things are much more powerful than what you get in today's technology. So one of the things about technology is we're being ever more interconnected through our phones, through our social media, but increasingly we're actually being more isolated. Virtual reality has that opportunity to open that up and take you to the places and the times and the people, so it's not just over there, it's actually there with you. One of the things that he actually did was a film called Clouds Over Sidra, and this is about Syrian refugees, and it's about a 12-year-old girl named Sidra, and he basically spent time filming her life in 360 so people could get a sense for that of what it's like to be in the camps. It's very powerful. If you haven't tried it, I would suggest you look at it. There are folks in also the Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab where Walter's at, Professor Jeremy Bellinson, who've been working on projects around empathy at scale. So they're actually looking to explore ways to design and test virtual reality experiences that teach empathy. So as you may have seen earlier, but experiments including whether or not seeing a 65-year-old avatar of yourself will allow you to save more for retirement, and actually that's been proven to be true. It's actually shown the case that people actually are more likely, twice more likely to save for retirement if they see themselves at that age. Or for example, if they are taking an experience and they're actually in a forest with an axe and they're chopping down a tree, they're more likely to actually conserve on paper and paper towel usage after they do that experience. So there are lots of things that certainly virtual reality can do for empathy and affecting change. I wanted to kind of show one as well. Let's see here. This is called the virtual human mirror. And Sanjeev, I'll need your help
Yes.
here. Yeah. So just let it run first. And then. So this one is actually, this one's an identity experience. Let me try to pull this guy up. So in this experience, it's putting you in the eyes of different ethnic and gender situations. So pretend I'm this guy. Pretend I'm a white, Caucasian male, middle-aged. I do have the goatee, so that's looking okay. I'm looking at myself in the mirror. I'm saying, hey, what's up? And I actually feel like, yeah, that's me, right? Now, if you hit number 1 on that left computer, now I'm an African-American female. It's a little bit disorienting at first because I look at my hands. They don't look like the color of my real hands. I look at myself in the mirror. It's actually matching what I'm doing. But over time, I'm starting to think, okay, I'm starting to identify more just because of the fact that she's mirroring exactly what I'm doing, and I don't get as alien a sensation for that. Now you can actually hit any of the other numbers. Yeah, now I'm a Caucasian female.
Blonde.
But this gives you a sense, and there's actually so it does actually allow you to self-identify more with different types of people and different types of races. And this has been proven to be very impactful for just understanding race relations and gender relations even. All right. Let's see. How are we doing for time? Okay.
Couple minutes.
Okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to, at this point, I'm not going to go through any more demos because I think that maybe you get a sense for it. There is one also that the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab has around ocean acidification, and it's very, very impactful. It does teach you about the fact that our oceans are dying, the coral reefs are dying, and people don't know why in general, but the reality is because of the sulfuric acid and carbon emissions. But again, these are ways to evoke empathy and to actually cause behavioral change once people actually go through these experiences. And we all know from research that's been done over decades that learning and experiencing things in VR or just in real life, whether it be virtual or not, is much more impactful from a retention basis than learning it from a book or learning it in hearing about it or even watching a video. So we've really understood, and I think we're really kind of at the stage now where empathy in VR has the ability to do a lot of good to the world. HTC has launched a VR for Impact fund. We announced that back at Davos, and that's a $10 million fund with the intention of actually bringing the good into virtual reality experiences, because we believe it's actually our responsibility, as well as anyone in technology's responsibility, to bring the good about VR and affect those kinds of behavioral changes and bring those empathetic experiences to the public. So we feel very passionately about that. And we're not necessarily an AI company, but we certainly are looking very closely at that. And of course, when you kind of marry those two things together, VR as a mechanism and delivery tool, and then AI as the way to be able to kind of also personalize that to your experience, I think those will be extremely powerful ways to change behavior to come. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Good stuff. I want some of that.
It's back
Yeah, just Thank you, Chris. Our last but not the least presenter is Dr. Skip Rizzo, where all of this actually gets applied to the world you're most familiar with, which is the clinical science world and the clinical application world. So you've now seen some examples of technology, applications, foundation. Now let's bring in the patient into this, and how do we make this patient-centric? So I'll give Skip Rizzo the platform now.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe if I could put that down here. Okay. So it should be popping up there.
Could we get this?
It's from the HDMI.
Sorry, Chris. All right. Let's just take a minute. While we're waiting for that, any questions for Chris Chin from a technology perspective?
Nice.
All right.
Hopefully we'll have sound here.
Skip, you ready?
All right. All good. Okay.
Yeah, I was just
Oh, you have a
talking.
question? Oh, so go ahead and ask a question.
Tell us a little bit about haptics and other types of systems that are coming online, and then I think that would be perfect.
Sure. Yeah. So the question's about. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So the question's about haptics and other types of systems that are coming online in the future. So as you could tell, we had controllers that are being tracked. We have our head through the HMD, which is the head-mounted display, being tracked. We also have things like the tracker. The Vive tracker is basically an accessory that uses the same tracking mechanism that you can attach to any appliance or even your legs and feet. So you actually now have full body tracking. From a haptic standpoint, there are gloves that actually are attached to the tracker that have vibration. There's actual audio-based haptic feedback, so you'll feel a minor sensation that comes out. There's wind feedback. There's a lot that's going on. We had a demo day yesterday for our accelerator program. We had 26 startup companies there. Someone had pain feedback, and that was accomplished through temperature. So they actually had temperature that gave you a sensation of heat and cold. They would combine that together to make pain and cause pain. So these things are actually all developing very rapidly. Kind of to what Sanjeev was talking about earlier, from a standpoint of understanding and sensing your emotion, there are now lots of technologies, lots of companies and startup companies out there that are sensing your eye movement, eye tracking, your facial expression, and it's really kind of quantifying all of your emotions and body. So a lot of biosensor activity happening that's leading to feedback to kind of make the whole loop full. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to present a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the applications and how we've worked with patients and how the research has served to drive some of the innovation in the area of clinical virtual reality. So with that, I'd like to just start off by mentioning our center. We're at the University of Southern California, Institute for Creative Technologies. We specialize in developing VR apps. We do a lot of military-funded work, but we also do things in the general civilian sector. And our lab is the MedVR Lab, a multidisciplinary group that since 1996 or so has developed applications in psych, cognitive, motor, and the use of virtual humans. Now, just a quick walkthrough, and then we'll take a deeper dive. Do we have any sound?
Oh.
Good. So this is an example of a simulation that we're using for treating PTSD with service members coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. We'll see a bit more of it, so I'm not going to leave that running for long. But just by point of comparison, that's what it looked like about 7 or 8 years ago. So you can see the graphics have improved. The technology's gotten better, faster, cheaper. And now it's no longer sort of a sci-fi vision to use VR clinically. We can deliver it in clinical offices and make a difference for patients, as you'll see from the data. In this case, what we did is we took a simulation built for PTSD exposure therapy and built a set of cognitive tests in it, tests of attention, memory, executive function. So we're able to take one simulation designed for one purpose and repurpose it for another application. But as I mentioned, we also do civilian work. This is from 1997, a mental rotation training system on a 3D visualization tool. And this delivered some really good data that at the time showed that what you do in a virtual world actually can have an impact on brain function and cognitive ability back in the Stone Age. Actually, the mid to late 90s was really the birth of the nuclear winter of virtual reality. There was a lot of hype and excitement during the early 90s about VR, but the technology wasn't mature enough to deliver on the vision. And so it was sort of viewed as a failed technology. But the people doing mental health and rehab, which, by the way, has probably the most evolved scientific literature of any VR application area, they hung in there because the vision was sound and compelling. So even though some of these things from those days were rather primitive, it's formed a basis of a scientific literature that we can draw on today. And now, not just wave our hands around and say, oh, VR is great, but that there's actually data, as we'll see in a little bit. Also, this is from 2004, I believe, a virtual classroom for testing kids with attention deficit disorder. So the child has to pay attention to the stimuli on the board and respond during a sequence, but if you turn the sound up a little bit, you hear a little knock on the door, the teacher goes and answers the door, the kid in the back just threw a paper airplane, a school bus by the side. This is what the child actually sees as they're looking around. So it's a controlled stimulus environment for testing attention, but in a relevant world. Moving on to the motor area, here's an example of some of our work with physical therapy and occupational therapy, basically using a Microsoft Kinect-like sensor. The user's not wearing any wires, instrumentation, markers. They're being tracked. And now we can build game-based VR. We can do things in ways that make the very boring and repetitive and frustrating work of physical and occupational therapy fun and engaging, maybe get people to do it more. Because we know that stuff works, it's just nobody does it enough to get the benefit of it. Well, some people do, I shouldn't say that, but it's very challenging, so doing it in this format may be helpful. This one was a variation on that theme. Cerebral Palsy Foundation wanted us to make computer games accessible to kids with severe motor impairment. So in this case, this little girl never played a video game in her life. She didn't have the motor capability to operate a gamepad or a keyboard or anything, but she had volitional control of this one movement. So we just track that movement and make that emulate the action of a gamepad. So now she can do the very simple game, the shark jumping game, but you can get more creative and do more complex games, like, if you want to go into an Xbox game like Forza Racer. You can drive a car if you're in a wheelchair simply by shifting forward or moving your head forward, side to side to steer, lean back to brake. It's all about the sensing, and we can do that now. So we can give people capabilities to do things in a digital world that they might not be able to do otherwise. Finally, our work with virtual humans. This is one we developed. This one's from 2012 or so. You'll see some of the more advanced stuff. It's a virtual patient for training novice clinicians at the USC School of Social Work, actually. They have a military social work program. And so here's an example of a social worker practicing their therapeutic skills with a virtual patient.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Castilla. What brings you in today?
Well, my wife told me she thought I should talk to someone. She's been pretty concerned about me since a soldier suicided on base last week.
Did you happen to know the soldier?
Yes. He wasn't a friend, but I met the Marine once or twice. He seemed normal at the time. I guess I'm afraid I might end up like him.
Do you have any plans to hurt yourself?
No. It certainly caught my mind, especially lately. I just need it all to stop. Sometimes I can't handle it.
So with these kinds of applications, I like to say that it gives novice clinicians a chance to screw up a bunch with a virtual patient before they get their hands on a live one. And from my clinical training, I definitely could have used that. Anyway, another variation of the theme is an online deliverable virtual human for healthcare support. This is one we did for the military a few years back for service members and veterans and their families that didn't want to go talk to a shrink. They didn't know if they had a problem. There's a lot of stigma, for better or worse, in this area. So they could go online and talk to this guy we called Sim Coach and ask questions about PTSD privately. The Sim Coach could ask questions back that were thinly veiled screening questions. So the character is getting to know the user's status a little bit, and at some point can give some advice, like, you know, geez, man, it looks like you're going through a hard time. If you want, I can pop up on the right a link from a website from the National Center for PTSD where you can punch in your zip code and a list of providers in your local area will pop up. So it's not about replacing good care by a live provider, but a toe in the water that might break down the barriers to care to get someone to actually get that help. I'll just let him introduce himself real quick here.
Well, I'm not a real person, if that's what you're asking, but I'm based on the personality and experiences of real soldiers and Marines. I'm still just a piece of software, but I'm getting better all the time, so hopefully I can be a helpful piece of software to talk to.
So with that said, I'm not going to spend much time on definitions. I think everybody gets what VR is, but just to say from the technology side, integration of enabling technologies, computers, interface devices, displays, whether they're head mounted or on a big projection screen, different ways of tracking the body, all about really what I prefer as a definition, a more human-centric definition, is basic HCI, basic human-computer interaction, making interaction with computers and complex data more natural and intuitive. And if we look at the last 20 years of HCI, maybe we need something to go beyond the hunt and peck power that we have for building PowerPoints and Word docs, and instead take advantage of this. Now, in mental health and rehab, the metaphor is simple. Simulation technology. Just as an aircraft simulator would serve to test and train piloting ability under a range of controllable conditions, we can test, train, teach, and treat human functioning across a wide range of areas. And in some sense, it's the ultimate Skinner box if you're a student of psychology. Controlled stimulus environments, but rather than that controlled stimulus environment being a light going on and a reaction time button, you're in a real world environment that we can control, a real world environment that has some relevance for whether it's a training or a therapeutic or an assessment objective. Now, over the years, and Walter spoke a little bit about this, in 1994, everybody used it, VR, clinically for phobia treatment. Fear of heights, fear of flying, fear of public speaking. But since that time, this is a short list of the areas that VR has added value either as an assessment tool, a tool for intervention, or a scientific, an aid to doing science with these groups. And this is a short list. The list grows every day. I'm amazed to see the different ways people now are applying clinical VR as a tool to enhance treatment. Now, when we talk about VR, think of the 3 I's: immersion, interactivity, and imagination. You don't always need all 3, but it's good to have at least 2. But when we talk about immersion, we're talking about what you already saw today. Wearing a headset that occludes you from the outside world and being in a simulated or synthetic environment that you can interact with. In this case, an Iraqi marketplace for part of PTSD treatment. But we can also do other things. In this case, you have a sensor in front of the headset that's tracking your hands in real time and making it so you have a first-person interaction with digital content for perhaps physical therapy. We've always done it in a third-person format, standing in front of the screen, but now you can really track your hands in real time and interact with these objects to do a wide range of upper extremity rehab. And this is part of a series of about 15 games that we've put together that we're now moving towards doing some clinical research with. And you'll see in a second You go from that to bimanual coordination. As long as you keep your hands like this, coordinated, you'll be able to fly that plane or that rocket ship through space for objectives. Interactivity. It doesn't always have to be immersive. So in this case, a balance training exercise, again using a Kinect, where you shift side to side to steer the penguin down the slope, you lean forward to go fast, you lean back to slow down. Think of an older person wearing a safety harness for fall prevention, you know, trying to train up some of those muscles to shift. It doesn't have to be a penguin. This was an open source game we got online, you know, Tux Racer free, you know, but you could build anything, you know, chasing butterflies or whatever that person likes. And there's so much VR content that's out there that can be reconfigured for purposes. I see a real big area emerging with this. It doesn't always have to be on a giant screen either. If you build compelling and engaging content, people will interact with it on a damn laptop, like in this case. You can also use interactivity to drive interaction with virtual humans. It doesn't always have to be immersive, although these characters look really good when they're in a Vive and you see them in stereo, but you can deliver them on a flat screen. So here's a case. We did this for the Dan Marino Foundation. The goal was to build job interview trainers for high-functioning people on the autism spectrum. People that can oftentimes do a job. They're very bright and insightful in a lot of ways, but they choke during a social interaction, and particularly in job interviews. So we had 6 characters built, 7 different backdrops to represent different jobs, and each character could be cranked up from, you know, soft touch interviewer to neutral to to cranky interviewer, as you'll see here. This character and this backdrop, nice.
I'm glad you're here. In a minute, we'll get into some questions about the job. But before we do, why don't you just tell me about yourself?
All right, now we can change up. We can go through an interview a bunch of times like that with that character or other characters. But then we can also change it up, pick a different character, a different backdrop, and make her cranky.
This is an entry-level position. I guarantee there will be things you won't like about this job. That said, what's the most important thing you think you're looking for in a job?
Not having to work with you. Okay, let's see. So when you think about what does VR bring to the table, you can go into specific assets, stimulus control, ecological validity, game features, safety, all those things. But to look at it more generally, think of expose, distract, motivate, or motivate, measure, and engage. So on the exposure thing, PTSD, phobias, addictive behaviors, putting people in provocative environments and help them overcome the challenges in the safety of a simulation. So the virtual Iraq scenario here, but it doesn't have to be about wartime content. It can be the mundane activities that are needed for fear of public speaking.
These results are promising. What impact do you think it may have in the future?
Don't you think that your point of view has certain limitations? How did you choose your presentation's approach?
All right, so these are public speaking scenarios that are pretty readily available on mobile phone-driven headsets. Now, going beyond expose, let's talk about distract. It was already mentioned once earlier, distracting people from painful medical procedures, acute pain. Now we're moving into chronic pain. This is an application that a kid could wear a headset when they're in a hospital bed and drive around with a little hand controller on this little racetrack thing. And you know, when you see the data in a minute, you'll see perception of pain drops off with this kind of distraction. Okay, motivate. Well, here's a stroke patient doing a VR simulation, a unique kind of a camera-based system. And watch this red ball, right there. That's what you want. You want to motivate that engaged activity when you're doing rehab, and that's what VR can do. By introducing gaming features into rehab, you get people to do more of it, and they might actually like it. Measure. The virtual classroom that I showed earlier, this is the updated version now. And you can put people in controlled stimulus environments where you can manipulate the cognitive challenge or the physical challenge, and introduce all sorts of distractions and see how well somebody can actually stay focused on a task. Finally, engage. Well, this covers all the areas. We can engage people in their care. We can engage them in their assessment. We can engage them in wellness activities by doing things in VR. As you saw with the Tai Chi and some of the other areas, you know, a lot of times people don't have patience in everyday life to take the time to learn it. But if you can put some of that stuff in a headset where it's all of a sudden kind of interesting, kind of fun, you may be able to teach things in a VR environment that matter in the real world and get people to actually do this stuff.
Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure
this is sort of a
environment.
virtual, not a virtual
I'm not a
therapist,
therapist.
but we'll see more of her later. I'm not going to let her run through. So let's talk a little bit about some data. First off, in the beginning, there was exposure therapy. And over the years, there's been like 5 or 6 meta-analyses looking at the combined literature over the years and applying it clinically. And basically for phobias and now with PTSD, you're seeing that VR outperforms the straight up imagination only PTSD or anxiety disorder treatment, but is as good as if you can do it in vivo, if you take people to where they're fearful, which is very challenging to do clinically. So this meta-analysis shows that what's done in VR, the approach activities that people do in VR actually translates to the real world. You see real world outcomes. So collected research in that area seems to be sound. In PTSD, let me just show a little bit more of what we do with that. This is just, I don't think I need to make the case that we have a significant challenge still on our hands. And I'm going to skip over this video. I'm going to skip this video. That just explains exposure. I'm assuming this crowd understands the idea of, with PTSD, helping people to go back and confront and process difficult emotional memories, but in a safe environment. Similar to the phobia work, you do it in VR, and as a person does it, they feel anxiety while they're doing it. But they also start to feel empowered because they're facing things they thought they never could face. They're talking about things with their therapist that they haven't talked to anybody about. So let me just show a collection of videos of the type of content. Over the years it's evolved. We have 14 different worlds that represent different contexts in which someone was traumatized in Iraq or Afghanistan. The clinician can control in real time the time of day, the sound effects, if an explosion occurs, if there's people in the crowd.
Like going through it there, it's not going through my head at night when I'm trying to sleep or when I'm with my wife, when times when I don't want it to come up and me start thinking about it. Traumatic things are not normal. You cannot handle the things that you've seen and done. And this is a tool that has helped me out tremendously.
Reliving the worst moments of his life has helped him to move on with his life.
I'm probably about 80% of who I was before I left. But I think that's pretty good after seeing and doing the things that we've done.
For Nightline, this is Dan Harris in Atlanta.
And aside from the idea of the clinical efficacy, this system's gone out to about 100 sites thus far. And a lot of times clinicians who are operating the system in real time, actually Wizard of Oz, creating the experience around the patient's narrative. A lot of times patient says, I feel like you understand my situation better because you're creating it as I speak and you're seeing it. And so aside from the efficacy issue, I think you're building a level of empathy with your clients that they understand each other. Because a lot of times working with vets, if you're not a vet, they don't take you seriously. So anyway. So some data. First clinical trial actually done here at the San Diego Naval Medical Center and at Camp Pendleton. Pre, post, 3-month follow-up. That's the individual data points. 16 no longer met PTSD criteria at the end of treatment. 4 did not benefit. Another study following up, same pattern of results, strong effect size. Another study done in an intensive format, a 3-week intensive treatment where VR exposure was done in the morning and in the afternoon, a range of psychosocial clinical applications were done with clients. So you see that maybe this is more a reflection of commitment, somebody willing to go for 3 weeks to a place and really, deal with their PTSD. They want to get over it. So that's a very strong, that's the 2.06 effect size. It's very strong. Another study out of Emory University showing progressive gains even after the treatment at 6 months and at 1 year follow-up with large sample size, 156. Also from that study, we're seeing physiological markers, in this case, startle response dropping off over time, one of the key symptoms, the hyperarousal component of PTSD, as well cortisol reactivity being reduced over time. So we're going beyond just self-report. We're trying to measure some objective physiological measures. Now, we've also done an expansion of this now where we're addressing military sexual trauma. Now, just want to, the caveat here, we're not creating virtual sexual assaults. We're creating the context that sexual assault survivors report these events happening to them. And so, built out a lot of civilian content, because even though our focus is on the military, they funded the project. Most sexual trauma in the military is not happening in the trenches of Afghanistan. It's happening around Camp Pendleton and around US bases. So that's a project that just recently got started. We've got 8 clients going through the initial feasibility trial. This is from the first 6 clients. So you can see the reduction thus far. If this holds up with a larger sample, I think we'll be in good shape that this could be translated quite easily to the civilian population. And that is our goal. I think probably some of the problems that we see with law enforcement and first responders, I think a lot of that is PTSD, emotional numbing, hypervigilance, quick startle response. Let's face it, it's an urban battlefield out there for police officers. They're confronted with trauma on a daily basis. I think it's almost unethical not to pay more attention to their needs. We pay a lot of attention to veterans. Yes, that's another thing we must do. But I think we got to take a closer look at doing a better job with law enforcement, first responders, victims of terrorist attack, and so on. I want to thank Dell, AMD, and Valve for donating a bunch of systems that we're distributing to VAs that don't have the funding to get this system. Those are going to be distributed in September. And then pain, just real quick, very early research, Hunter Hoffman's landmark work, basically comparing an already distracting procedure, Nintendo, with a primitive head-mounted display and showing dramatic differences by immersing somebody in a virtual environment and giving them something to do while they're getting daily wound care for their burns. And on the right, you see the effect prevailing over multiple trials. In that case, it was for physical therapy after a skin graft, which if you've ever seen that or heard it, it's very, extremely painful. And you're seeing reductions that continued over 7 sessions. These findings are very durable. They've held up in many studies since that time. Game-based rehab, real quick, some interesting work in terms of motivation. Using high-end equipment, this is using a haptic master, a force feedback device that can both provide forces to push against your movement if needed, or to help guide your movement. Some really great work being done in New Jersey on it, but also delivering after 20 hours of training, delivering measurable effects, not only in kinematics, but actually on real-world assessments of function. And we see this kind of work published quite regularly, now showing it outperforms usual care. This just came out a couple months ago, more effective than traditional methods. I think it's motivating. I think we're always operating from the base of what works in the real world and how can we enhance it in the virtual world? How can we amplify that effect? I think the amplification comes, we get people to do it more. Because we're doing the same thing, we're encouraging motor movement. Finally, in the cognitive assessment area in rehab, this is just some data from that virtual classroom. Again, you've seen this before, just showing we can clearly show differences between kids with ADHD and healthy controls. And now the findings have been extended to other clinical populations with attention impairments. Finally, the last thing is some of the AI work with virtual humans. Now, this is that job interview system. You can see the characters the different characters, different backdrops, but I want to have a client who never would have gone in front of a camera until she went through this program. And here's her talking about her experience.
It's a good program, and it teaches you how to do an interview, and it teaches you how to be in an interview situation with another person.
And did you see your performance improve? Did you get better?
I get better every single time I do it. I get better.
And that's the data from 64 people that went through the program, where you see real-world interview ratings by voc counselors, pre and post, and the progressive improvements with training. But that's not a measure of the effectiveness of this system. It's an initial trial. It might be a better assessment tool in this case, because there's other things going on in this program, you know, actual job coaching, training with real people. But, you know, this is first pass encouraging data to support the continued work. And now it's being used with veterans at the U.S. Vets program in Los Angeles. And we're building out the content around more veterans.
It's hard to find a job.
Veteran-centric issues. Anyway, and some of the early ratings by veterans on different topics about using it, the first 17 people to go through. You always want to test with your targeted user group early on in order to get a real assessment that you're on the right track and what you need to evolve it. Anybody my age will get that joke. Okay, I mentioned the virtual human stuff from previously. Well, this is the virtual patient work. This is our virtual patient toolkit now. 40 different characters that can be inflated to 3 different weight classes that now can be authored by clinical experts. We have built a dialogue management system. You can go in and author patients, and there's a lot of standardized stuff in there, but you can begin to move the needle forward in clinical training by, again, giving people a chance to screw up a bunch with a virtual character before they get their hands on a live one.
Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure environment. I'm not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would love to learn about you. I'll ask a few questions to get us started.
In this instantiation, this character is a clinical interviewer.
Your answers are totally
and there's a webcam capturing the user's face and gesture and vocal prosody. So
how are you doing
right now
today?
she's warming them up.
I'm doing well.
That's good. Where are you from originally?
So build rapport. But then,
I'm from
about 8 minutes in.
When was the last time you felt really happy?
When was the last time?
So behavioral analytics are being tracked, going into the system.
Yeah, I'm not someone who's really like, I don't have any real highs. I feel like I'm a level person. It's just happy. I guess to answer your question, probably a couple months ago.
I noticed you were hesitant on that one. Would you say you were generally a happy person?
So if he had answered that question like, oh, just the other day I went to a party, had a great time with my friends, she just would have went on to the next question. But by sensing those behaviors, now she's reflecting back in a way that builds a little bit of credibility. So you've got the real-time adjustment of options for follow-ups to a response. But as well, that information gets quantified. What happened?
Okay.
All right, well, let me just tell you what happens. We quantify that stuff. Whoa. We quantify all these behavioral analytics. And,
oh, there we go.
Oh, here we go. All right, so we quantify a bunch of these. I'll go faster because we're getting near the end. And we can, with known groups and large samples, we can begin to detect differences in psychological distress, in facial expression, in vertical eye gaze, smile intensity. Distressed people smile as many times as healthy controls. They just do little short, polite smiles, non-robust. You can pick all that up. Touching your face, fidgeting, and a lot of vocal prosody elements. We're picking up. We're mining things from how people talk. Not what they say, but how they say it. That is really being predictive. So finally, I left off imagination, the third eye. I just want to close with that and say, there's been a lot of imagination going on in this field for many years. Really, the first head-mounted display there, before the sword of Damocles. And the vision in the 90s was, get into the computer, Tron-like, get into the game. The reality in the 90s, unfortunately, it was crap. Anybody who tried a headset back then, will attest to that fact. But then a funny thing happened. This guy, Palmer Luckey, was no longer in the field for various reasons, but he was working in our lab and had this idea about building a headset, and he went off and got a Kickstarter and off to the races. Got actually $3 billion out of Facebook for his company without a product. But what that did, regardless of what you think of Oculus, all these other companies now have come into the fray, and this is my favorite, what we have right here, the Vive headset. But a lot of options now, low-cost options. That now this is not pie in the sky. This is something that you can do in your office or in a research lab. And it's driven a whole ecosystem of interface device imagination. People are building cool things for how do you walk around in these environments? How do you select objects? Yes, you get a misstep every now and then, but we're seeing more and more popular media and public attraction to VR. Some people would say it's overhyped, that we're running into the same problem we ran into in the early 90s. Too much hype, we build up too much expectations, not delivering on it. Some creepy things there. But we do know that this stuff is capturing imagination. We owe it to ourselves and we owe it to our clients, and we owe it to the field of healthcare to embrace this stuff and move forward. And there's money to be made. Goldman Sachs report, look what comes in second place after gaming and entertainment, healthcare. So we're seeing this as well in startups. VBI was a company from the 90s, about the only one for many years. In the last 2 years, there have been more mental health and rehab startups than in the previous 20. Neuroscience people tend to agree stimulus control is important, but clinicians in psychotherapy seem to agree. When asked what were the top things that are going to change the next 10 years in therapy, VR came in fourth. And 4 of the top 5 were tech-based: mobile apps, web-based treatment, teletherapy, and VR. For the young at heart, certainly my niece and nephew, when I first got my Gear VR mobile phone thing, they loved it. But it's not just for kids. And I went to visit my mom in Connecticut. Got in at like 3 in the morning. My flight was delayed, but she waited up for me. And I go, Ma, you got to try this thing.
It's so real. My God, it looks like my backyard, my yard with the snow. Oh, Lord in heaven. How they ever can create this. You know what? I'm hanging onto the sink because I'm afraid I'm going to fall down the cliff. Hey, honest to God. You feel like, if you step off, you're going to fall right in there. Holy mackerel.
Holy mackerel is right.
If you're watching this, please fund my son's research so that he can take care of me in my old age.
You gotta have your mom make the pitch for you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Bernard, I know we're running a few minutes late here, and there's a party on the deck there. Is it okay to do a few questions with the panelists? Okay, 3 questions. Okay. And I know Skip and you have flights.
We'll pop up the demo. We don't wait till after the panel and people that want to stick around.
If anybody wants to try the actual equipment, it's available here. But I'll open up the session now just to, answer your questions first. I know everybody has to travel as well probably today. So We have Dr. Walter Greenleaf, Christian, and Dr. Skip Rizzo, so ask away. Okay, Beth.
Thank you. So, we saw your mom do it, and that's really wonderful. One of the things that I hear when we're looking at installing both digital, any kind of digital tools, but especially VR, is people assume that there's going to be age limits on this, and that older people are not going to be interested. In your experience, I know, Walter, you've run the Center on Longevity at Stanford, and gotten to see Skip, you put this on a lot of folks, and Chris, a lot of experience. What's your experience with age limitations around this?
So the question is experience around age limitations across this domain.
I could pop in real quick and say, well, I'm 63 and I'm designing things that I'm hoping are going to help me in 10 years. So the cohort of people that will be using these things as they evolve are people that kind of grew up kind of digital. Let's face it, a lot of older people, it's foreign to them. Maybe email is as close as they get. And yeah, you're going to have a cell, but I swear to God, you put some of these headsets on an older person, there's tons of stuff on YouTube where you can see this. With the first time they just turn their head a second and everything updates and they're looking around, it's sort of a universal, jaw dropper. You always see the headset and then, like that. So it might be a little bit more work, and it might be a little bit more of a persuasive sell, and it might not be for everyone. But certainly, the aging population is becoming more and more populated with people like me and Walter here.
Except for people with vertigo and some other issues, which is not necessarily age specific, I haven't seen any problems. I think it's a natural user interface, and that's a lot easier than getting someone who is older or has a cognitive impairment to text or to type. So I haven't seen any barriers there.
Chris?
Yeah, I would say the only other thing was, what I've seen in some of the maybe more elderly is they would prefer a seated experience because it can be a little bit discombobulating just because they're not used to it. But that's, my parents are in their 80s and they had no problem. They did have that jaw-dropping moment, so for sure.
Bernard? Question? So drivers and inhibitors to be universally used in clinic.
It's really the same problems with any new medical technology. It's coming up with the business model. It used to be people didn't know what VR was. I don't think that's a problem now. I think it's more we haven't had adequate validation studies, and it's not the cost. It's not the usability. There's some great products in the pipeline, but I think the problem is understanding the workflow of the medical environment, pricing it the right way, having validation to facilitate the funding of the use of the technology. It's the business barriers more than anything else, not technology barriers, not research barriers.
And the health outcomes that you mentioned, Skip, are getting us to that point.
I think that the popular media has done us a disservice and a favor. Disservice in some ways, expecting that VR was going to, overwhelm the gaming industry in the first year that these things started to come out. But it's also driven popular media awareness. So, people know in our culture what VR is. Even if they haven't tried it, they got a general idea. The challenge I see, though, is there's a lot of those startup companies I popped up. A lot of those are driven by people that were in the game development industry. And in that ecosystem, you build a cool game, people will love to play it, they'll pay to play it, and you're a success. They don't realize that in mental health, rehab, medicine, you have to have some evidence. You have to have some data to support that what you're doing, even your specific application, is going to work. Otherwise, then it's quackery, really.
And I think that's a very important point. I'm a little bit worried once, especially with mobile VR, a lot of people have a VR system, that it's a very powerful intervention. And I think the barrier is going to be low. People will download an app and
Right.
it won't necessarily be validated, and I think there will be, and you've seen the developers that just throw everything out there, they don't
Yep.
worry about validation.
It-
So I think the barrier for some of these apps is going to be too low, in a way.
The classic case in point here is what I showed with the Fear of Public Speaking app. There's like 5 or 6 of them that you can easily download at a low cost and treat yourself with your fear of public speaking. Now, psychologists, we're kind of willing to accept that as like relatively benign. Everybody's got a little bit of fear of public speaking. It's a skill trainer, you get a little bit of practice. And so, all right, fair enough. But that starts a slippery slope, because what about the next one? Well, it's only fear of flying, or it's only, claustrophobia. But what that's doing is, it's opening the door to self-diagnosis and self-treatment in a lot of cases that people might go that route rather than get the real care or the supervised care that they could benefit from. So I'm working with IEEE right now, putting together standards on this, and just recently wrote a piece that'll appear in the journal Neuropsychology, both about breaking down barriers to care using VR, in addition to the efficacy, but also the idea of what are going to be our ethical standards for safe use of these things. And if anybody wants to contact me, I'll give you my card. I make my talk and all the videos freely available, as well as any papers that you might like on the data.
Bernard, you had a question?
Related to this.
And then you.
Are you seeing beyond the U.S. government interest from the payer community in healthcare towards helping support these VR development efforts?
Walter.
Yes, some of the insurance carriers have put together programs to facilitate trials and validation. They're as eager as anyone else to find out more effective tools for getting involved. And foundations are putting in support. I think it's a momentum that's gathering right now, and it's not just at the research level. It's sort of escaped the research lab at this point.
Yeah. Anything that's going to lower costs and improve outcomes, right? That's the payer model. So they're very eager to see this being adopted, and there are some startups that are getting FDA approvals also, and that's kind of opening up the tents for everyone else.
Well, let me put a cautionary tale in. Sometimes the best ideas, no matter how much they're in your heart, and you think you got something that's really going to fly, sometimes you get disappointed. We did a demo of the virtual patient toolkit a couple days ago to this mega VC guy, and it was demo went perfectly, and he looks at it and he goes, "Well, this is great, but it's kind of academic. I can't see who's going to pay for this. Are hospitals going to pay for better clinical training, or medical schools? How many medical students are there? Who's going to actually pay for it?" And it's like, well, I thought anybody would want to pay for something that's going to improve, reducing errors and doing better case histories so that you can reduce costs on the back end and not assign so many diagnostic procedures. A good case history would and so it broke my heart, but maybe he's just sort of short-sighted. But the guy has a track record of making money, and so I have to listen to him, and say, well, is this an academic thing we should just put out into the wild and get fame and glory but never commercialize? Or
I think that's a good point, Skip. I think the business engineering needs to be done. For this too, and most of the startups I see, either they know technology but they don't know medicine, or they know a little bit of medicine but they don't know technology, and almost none of them are very savvy when it comes to understanding the workflow or the reimbursement or the regulatory issues. And it really takes all 3 components in order to have a successful product.
Thank you very much, and thank all of our speakers for being with us today.
You can